Hello friends, nice to speak to you again. This past Monday, I don't know when you're going to get this message, but Monday was Memorial Day in the U.S. Now, I'm half American, my father was American, most of my father's family American, and so it was a sort of a special day for him, because my father, he died when I was an infant. I never knew him. He was killed in the Second World War, so there is a bit of Memorial Day about that in him. Now, when I was left without a father, the one man in my life who meant more to me than anybody else, and probably, I think back over the years, the most wonderful, loving, caring man was my grandfather. My grandfather died in probably the late 60s, 70s, early 70s in North Carolina. And he's buried in a grave there. And every time I go to his town, Marion, North Carolina, I visit his grave and look and ponder. And when we look at graves and you think about graves, people always say and refer to them as our final resting place. You know, and at that final resting place for my grandfather, I know on Monday there would be flags, the Stars and Stripes, placed in all the graves around that cemetery in remembrance of Memorial Day. But you know, a final resting place is what they say, but for a child of God, that is not really a fact, is it? Because that is not our final resting place. I know that my grandfather is already with the Lord, because when he died, he left. But when he died, his tent, as Paul called it, the body that we live in life, was very lovingly and very carefully laid to rest in that cemetery. And that's what we can consider perhaps as God's waiting room. I'd like to call that God's waiting room. It's what my grandpa and what we will all be waiting for in God's waiting room. It reminds me of the verse in Titus chapter 2, verse 11 to 13, where Paul says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age." And then verse 13 says, "While we wait for the blessed hope." While we wait. What are we waiting for? Well, verse 13b, the second part says then, "While we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ." That's what people are waiting for in those waiting rooms. Those cemeteries, those graves. Many of you have loved ones in cemeteries, graves. Maybe you've got people that were cremated instead, but that doesn't change the fact that they're still waiting. And in his resurrection message to the Corinthians, Paul tells us how this will happen and what we're going to look like. 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come?" And Paul says, "How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies." On many graves, you'll see a symbol of a sheath or a wheat germ. And that's placed there because we're reminded of that with Jesus' words when he said in John 12:24, "Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." And Paul says, when you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. So it will be, he says, with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. The body that we wear, this earth suit that we carry, this tent, is perishable. We are all slowly dying. Our bodies are falling apart. But when it is sown, in other words, when we are placed in the ground, then it becomes imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, Paul says. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. I think of my grandfather, wonderful, wonderful man that he was. His body gave way. His body finished. His earth suit, his tent collapsed, and he was placed in the ground. But I know how much of a strong Christian he was. I know how much he loved and cared for me. I know what a difference he made to my life. And he planted a seed in me. And he's planted many seeds in others. And I know that he is already with the Lord. But he is waiting patiently for that body, that resurrection body, that new body that we will all receive to spend eternity with in Jesus. The final part I would say is, as James told us in 5, be patient. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. May God bless you and have a wonderful day.